So, good morning to everybody. We're going to be covering in this Banquet of the Word the Christmas season uh, and treating it both from the point of view of the liturgy and also from um, the sources of our Christmas story, largely the Bible, but that there are some other sources too, which we might find a little bit surprising for all of the elements and traditions of our Christmas story that have come down to us over the last couple of thousand years. So today is Tuesday, December 19th, and once again, welcome to all of you. And let's begin, as we usually do, by praying, and this prayer will be the collect prayer for the Mass during the day, the daytime Mass of Christmas. So let's simply say together, O God, who wonderfully created the dignity of human nature and still more wonderfully restored it, grant, we pray, that we may share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Let's begin now, after our prayer, by taking a look at where we are in the liturgical year. I think most of us know that we begin the liturgical year of 2018. We began it a couple of weeks ago with the first Sunday of Advent. And following Advent, we will have the Christmas season, and it's a Christmas season that we are covering today. And then we have a period of ordinary time. It's actually only about 5 Sundays in ordinary time before we begin Lent. And with Lent, of course, that culminates in Easter and the Easter Triduum, the great 3 days, beginning in the evening of Holy Thursday with the Mass of the Lord's Supper and culminating in Easter Sunday with the high point being the Easter Vigil. And then the season of Easter, concluding with Pentecost and a couple of other Sundays after that, Trinity and Corpus Christi. And then we go back to ordinary time for the rest of the year. My, how time flies. So let's think about Christmas season in regard to the liturgical year. This liturgical year, 2018, began with the first Sunday of Advent just a couple of weeks ago, December 3rd. And this year, Advent is only 3 weeks long, 3 weeks and 1 day. It ends at sundown on the fourth Sunday of Advent, which is Christmas Eve, December 24th. Christmas season begins on Christmas Eve and extends to the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord on Monday, January 28th. So Christmas season is only a little bit more than 2 weeks long. The first week of ordinary time begins the next day, Tuesday, January 9th. And the following Sunday will be the second Sunday in ordinary time. There is no first Sunday in ordinary time. Ordinarily, the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord, if Epiphany is celebrated on the 6th rather than on the Sunday around the 6th of January, the following Sunday would be the first Sunday of ordinary time, which is replaced by the baptism of the Lord. So February 11th will be the 6th Sunday in ordinary time. And then following that, Wednesday after that, we begin Lent on Ash Wednesday, February 14th. So let's get into our celebration of Christmas. The proper liturgical title of Christmas Day, or Christmas, is the Solemnity of the Nativity of the Lord. There's various liturgical rankings for feasts. The the highest ranking is that of solemnity, and then under solemnity is feast. The big, and then under that actually is memorial, a memorial of um, an obligatory memorial and an optional memorial. Those are the basic rankings of liturgical days. There's a few sub-rankings there which we need not to get into right now. That actually, in the calendar of 1970, replaced a very elaborate, some may remember the, the doubles, first class, second class, and so on, many different sorts of a complex series of how we rank feasts. Now it's very simple. There are 4 rankings: solemnity, feast, memorial, obligatory memorial, and optional memorial. And so there are 4 masses given in the liturgy, 4 distinct sets of liturgical texts. One is for the vigil, which is basically Christmas Eve, and then midnight, and a Mass at dawn, and the Mass during the day. The Mass of the Vigil is one that the Gospel is from Matthew, just the very beginning of Matthew, and that's the Gospel that I love to proclaim. Not everybody loves to listen to it, and a lot of people do not like to proclaim it because it is the lengthy genealogy of Jesus, going from Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Joseph and his brothers, and so on and so forth. Giving the lineage of Jesus according to the custom and, if you will, also the legal standing, giving Jesus basically legal standing among the Jewish people. And it goes down to Joseph, who is the husband of Mary. Doesn't say father of Jesus, but the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. And then Matthew goes into the second part of that, which is usually all that is read on Christmas Eve. They omit the genealogy, which, as I said, I don't like to do. But the story of the Annunciation to Joseph, the angel appearing to Joseph in the dream. Joseph has a dilemma because he was not living together with Mary, and she turns up pregnant, and his dilemma is what to do about this. And notice one thing that God doesn't do, which is very interesting. God does not forestall the dilemma. God allows the dilemma to play forward and then gives Joseph the key to resolving the dilemma. So it's not like, we often think, well, if God's God, why doesn't he prevent things from happening? Why doesn't he prevent bad things from happening? So on and so forth. Well, here we've got an example where he doesn't prevent Joseph's dilemma or his problem. He lets Joseph fully experience this dilemma of his pregnant virgin wife, and then points towards the resolution. Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child in her was conceived by the Holy Spirit. At midnight, we have Luke's account of the birth of Jesus, and the shepherds are brought in. And I use the word Annunciation kind of advisedly here, because we tend to, when we hear Annunciation, we think of the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary. But really, the angels appear to Joseph, the angel appears to Joseph, the angel appears to Zechariah, angel appears to the shepherds, star appears to the Magi, and in a sense, all of those make up God's revelation to these particular people, and through these particular people, God's revelation in His Word to us. So I think it is appropriate to kind of reflect on the fact that in the Scripture and in the account of the birth of Jesus, there are multiple annunciations, that God is intervening there and announcing His presence and His power to various people in various ways. So the Mass at midnight is basically what we, at least in our imaginations, see taking place in the dead of night, and that is the birth of Jesus in the darkness and the shepherds watching over their flocks by night. Mass at dawn, this has been a very, very strongly traditional Mass for Christmas for many years, and we'll see a little inkling of its significance a bit later. But the Mass at dawn then continues the Gospel of Luke by talking about the visitation of the shepherds, and Mary, hearing what the shepherds have to say and how this was revealed to them, ponders these things, and the shepherds return praising God. And then the Mass during the day from John essentially speaks of the origin of Jesus, but going back into eternity, the origin of the Word become flesh, as it's narrated in the beginning of the first chapter of John. So we are covering the things that happened and reflecting on their meaning when we cover all four Masses, Mass texts. Even if we don't go to all of those Masses, it's perhaps good to read ahead of them and reflect on the meaning. The other texts, the Old Testament reading, usually from Isaiah, not all of them, and the New Testament readings, also, we're not going to go into that, but they also kind of help to unfold and to understand the mystery that we're celebrating here. Now, there are some saints associated with Christmas on Christmas Day and beyond during Christmas week. And there are some very interesting saints here. For one thing, and most of us don't really realize that there are a number of saints whose feast days occur on Christmas, even if we don't celebrate them. Two very interesting ones. Saint Anastasia, she was a married woman, martyr, in 304, at the very end of the persecution of Diocletian. And in the 5th century, or the 500s, she was honored at the Mass at dawn of Christmas. And so Christmas Masses tended to have various elements of the mystery, the vigil, of course, the midnight, but the Mass at dawn, traditionally, in the earliest tradition, actually belonged to, if you can use that expression, belonged to St. Anastasia. And then the Mass during the day celebrated not so much, as we saw, not so much the particular events of Christmas, but rather the incarnation itself, the meaning of the Word made flesh and dwelling among us. The other one, whom we are all familiar with, even though we might not know it, and he's not canonized, and he was a bit of a strange character, Blessed Jacopone di Todi. I love to say that. Blessed Jacopone di Todi. He was married, became a widower, always had a burden of guilt that he carried around with him, and he never really fully resolved it because he was rather severely abused by his father, and so he wished his father dead. And when his father died, he just couldn't handle the guilt. And like I say, he tried to address it with a life of penance as a Franciscan, but never quite managed to fully resolve it in this life. But he was a poet, and he wrote a lot of rather famous poetry, the most famous of which is, and this is how we know him, the Stabat Mater, the hymn to Mary that we sing during Lent at the Stations of the Cross. Jacopone di Todi is the author of that, and so might give him a little thought on Christmas. We all know St. Stephen is the day afterwards, particularly when we sing about good King Wenceslaus. St. Stephen, the first martyr, very appropriate that we celebrate the first one to knowingly shed his blood in witness to Jesus on the day after the Incarnation, celebrated on the day after the Incarnation. St. John the Evangelist is celebrated the next day, again, very fitting because he is the one whose gospel records so very much the significance and meaning of the Incarnation and the events that embody our salvation in Jesus. 28th, the Holy Innocents, those children who were slaughtered by King Herod, as recorded in Matthew's Gospel. And 29th is St. Thomas Becket. He is observed as an optional memorial. That's why I have the brackets around him. The next day, and we all know Thomas Becket as the martyr killed by the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the saint in whose honor the pilgrimage went to Canterbury, and Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. And then 31st, St. Sylvester. And of course, whenever I think of St. Sylvester, I always think of the cat and Tweety Bird, but I didn't put them up on that. But Sylvester was a very interesting and significant saint because he was the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, at the time of Constantine, the first Bishop of Rome who was not enduring persecution. He had a 22-year-long reign, which was rather long. And he was the Pope also at the time of the Council of Nicaea. So he lived at a very significant point in the history of the Church. Now, he's not necessarily well known in this country. In Germany and some other countries, Christmas Eve is always called Sylvester Day. And in fact, in Germany, they have some concerts, particularly in Berlin. The Berlin Philharmonic will always have a St. Sylvester Day concert as their New Year's Eve concert. And then, of course, we have the First Lady, St. Melania, the younger. She died in 439. She is celebrated, actually, and canonized along with her husband, St. Pinian, who died about a year later, I believe. And the interesting thing about Melania, whom nobody has ever heard of until she became First Lady, was her mother was a saint also, Melania the Elder. And she was the wealthiest woman in the Roman Empire at that time. Her family, together with her husband, had probably owned, were the greatest landowners, let's say, in the entire Roman Empire. And she divested nearly all of her property and wealth and holdings as a gift to monasteries and for the care of the poor. And she herself became something of a wandering, she and her husband became something of a wandering hermit. And they were supporters of various saints and of the maintenance and upkeep of shrines in the Holy Land. And there is speculation that she more than anybody, any other single person, may have been responsible for the fall of Rome, because her divesting of her wealth into church-related things, which of course at that time, sort of like today, we hope it continues, at that time was not taxable. It could not produce wealth for the support of the Roman armies. And therefore, the Roman armies became less effective at warding off the various barbarian invasions. And it was a very, very interesting time, because that was a time when the Western Roman Empire became weaker and weaker, and the Eastern Roman Empire and Constantinople became the dominant and stronger one. And Melania had something to do with that, apparently. So those are our saints. Some very well known, a few others kind of interesting characters to pay attention to. Let's go to the Feast of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. This is the Sunday within the octave of Christmas. Unless, of course, Christmas itself occurs on a Sunday, then it's on the, I think, the day before the octave of Christmas. Possibly the day after, I don't remember. A question that I very often will address in celebrating the Holy Family is we tend to think of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as being in sort of splendid isolation. And granted, Mary did not have any other children. The brothers and sisters of Jesus that are depicted in the Bible, some will say, especially in the Western Church, that they were cousins. Others will say in the Eastern Church that they were children of Joseph by a former marriage. I personally think that that is the most credible explanation, that Joseph was probably a relatively wealthy widower and who had children, and those children needed a mother. They needed a mother in the family. And Mary evidently had committed herself to the Lord as a virgin, which was common among certain elements of Jewish religion at that time. Not widespread, but there were certain there were certain groups that did value virginity, and apparently Mary and probably Joseph were part of that group. So she would have, in essence, committed herself as a virgin, but she needed, in that society, she needed a male protector. Now, everybody knew that this would then be a marriage without normal marital relations, that Joseph would agree to marry this virgin to protect her virginity in exchange for her serving as the mother of his children and caring for them as a mother would. So the question that, I'm an only child. So it's always a kind of an interesting thing for me, because I always so much identified with Jesus being an only child. And yet the likelihood is that he was not raised as an only child, that he was not raised as just the family of Jesus, of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, living in their house and carpenter shed, work shed next to it, and that sort of thing. That there was probably a very rich family dynamic in that household, with a bunch of other, for Jesus, kind of legal half-siblings. So as families are in the Middle East and in many traditional countries, it was a very, very dynamic, probably not terribly contemplative family, but actively religious in their relationships with each other. Now, on this Feast of the Holy Family, there are three Gospels for year A, which is the year of Matthew, the flight into Egypt, and the return to Nazareth. It omits, you'll notice there are 4 verses that are omitted there from 16 to 18, 3 verses, I guess, that deal with the massacre of the infants. So they omit that in order to tell a narrative of the flight into Egypt and then the return to Nazareth. And in year B, which is this year, we have a rather lengthy gospel, a presentation in the temple, and the story of Simeon and Anna there who greet Mary, Joseph, and Jesus in the temple. And then year C, I always like to consider this event around the 12-year-old Jesus. That was the year of his bar mitzvah. So what we have there is, even though the traditions around the celebration of bar mitzvah are more recent in origin, nonetheless, there was always this realization that at about the age of 12 or 13, a boy became a man, became a son of the covenant. And that's basically what bar mitzvah means, the son of the covenant. Prior to that, he is a child very much on the receiving end of growing up. At 12, he becomes independently a child, a son of the covenant. And what we have, therefore, in St. Luke's Gospel, his staying in the temple, he was taking that very seriously. He was basically saying, yeah, now I'm independent. So this is my Father's house, and so I will stay there. I sometimes think that this also is Jesus still being enough of a boy that he is kind of naughty. But be that as it may. On January 1st, we have the Solemnity of Mary, the Mother of God. And here, the gospel is the shepherd's visit, and Mary pondered. And Jesus then is named at his circumcision on the 8th day. Now, the meaning of the circumcision is that Jesus becomes a son of the covenant, a child of the covenant, perhaps we could say, because the bar mitzvah is becoming an adult son of the covenant. The meaning of Jesus' name is Yeshua or Yehoshua, which means God saves. It was a very common name in the Old Testament. So it was very likely that Jesus grew up with other boys who were carrying the same name, and that there were many others that he may have associated with that same name. Very common name, for example, Joshua was essentially the same name. But the significance of it, obviously, for Jesus, the kind of the twofold significance of God saves, and then the similar meaning of that title, Emmanuel, the God is with us. There was a custom. Only one name was given. A second identifier would be from family or place or occupation or title. Jesus at some points is called the Son of Mary. At other points, he's called the Son of Joseph. At other points, he's called Jesus of Nazareth. Family, place, occupation, Jesus the carpenter. And then, of course, we have the title, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ. I can't resist saying, one time somebody approached me after Mass. He was a rather intelligent person. But he said, I have a question. If Christ was Jesus' last name, why don't we say Joseph Christ or Mary Christ? And in my mind, I went, but the resolution to that question is Christ is the title, means Messiah, means the anointed one. So then we have the Epiphany. The word Epiphany in Greek means manifestation. It originally celebrated three distinct but closely related events: the visit of the Magi, recorded in Matthew's Gospel, the baptism of Jesus, and the wedding feast at Cana. All three of those were originally contained in this idea of the Epiphany. Now, in the medieval West, the Magi became the three kings. Their identity and number were basically derived, I think, from the number of the gifts and the kind of gifts. They were gifts of the wealthy, of royalty. And so we have the gospel account of the visit of the Magi. And then the next day, January 8th, because the Epiphany takes place on, or is transferred from the 6th to Sunday, which this year is the 7th. As it's celebrated now, it really is a very, very modern feast. In fact, until I started looking this up, I never realized how modern it was, because this baptism was originally an element of celebrating the Epiphany. But because the Magi dominated the Epiphany, it was Pius XII in 1955, not that long ago. A few of the older ones here may have been living at that time. In 1955, Pius XII established a celebration of the baptism on the octave day of the Epiphany, which was January 13th. You might remember that. But it was not that long after the octave of the Epiphany became the baptism that the Roman calendar of 1970 transferred it to the Sunday after the Epiphany. And in countries where the Epiphany is transferred to Sunday, like the United States and many other countries, it's celebrated on the following Monday. Most of the countries that did not transfer the Epiphany to Sunday, it's because they observe January 6th as a holiday, as a civil holiday. And even many of the countries in secular Europe, they still celebrate the Epiphany on the January 6th and don't have to go to work on that day. The Feast of the Baptism of the Lord concludes the Christmas season. Ordinary time begins the next day. So that goes through the season. Now our question is going to be, where does the Christmas story come from? And something that we don't often think about is the big difference in the way that each gospel tells the story. And the gospels tend not to duplicate each other in many of the details, and there is a reason for that. It's according to the author's purpose and the audience that he is addressing. And we'll see a little bit more of that in a minute or two. Now, there are also early traditions from the apocryphal Gospels, especially the infancy Gospel of James, and there are some details from the Old Testament, which are read forward as seen as prophecies, as referring to Christ. One of the details from Isaiah, and I was going to look up the chapter and verse, and I didn't, but having to do with the beasts of burden giving homage to the king, the Messiah, the ox and the ass. And one of the earliest styles of depiction of the birth of Jesus will always feature the ox and the ass. They may not feature Jesus, may not feature Mary and Joseph. There's one that that I just love, that just has Jesus wrapped in swaddling clothes there in the manger, and there's the ox and there's the ass. And that's it. And in some ways, they represent us, I think. So, Christmas story in the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark. Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. Originally, way early on, it was thought that Mark was an abridgment of Matthew. And that's why the order is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They thought that was a chronological order, with Mark coming after Matthew, being sort of the Reader's Digest condensation of Matthew. However, it's really evident if you really look at the text of Mark as well as its relationship to the other Gospels. It's pretty hard to avoid the conclusion that Mark had to come first, and that both Matthew and Luke depended on Mark along with other sources. So Mark, they figure, is up right around 70 AD, somewhere right around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple. So that would be, what, almost 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Very little is known about the place or origins or the audience or its purpose. We'll tell a little more about Mark at the next presentation, where we will go into the Gospels of the Ordinary Time, because this is the year of Mark, Ordinary Time, year B. All that the Gospel of Mark says basically about the human origins of Jesus, or the origins of Jesus, is found in the very first verse. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Of course, that says a lot. Here we have the affirmation of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. So it affirms his divinity, and it affirms that he is the Messiah. And it affirms that the story of Jesus is not intended simply to be biographical, but it is the announcement of the good news, the good message. It is because that is what the word gospel means, the good message of God to humankind. And so this good message or good news of Jesus Christ, that is what Mark is after professing in the rest of his gospel. From that point, it goes on into talking about John the Baptist. So most of the Christmas story comes from Matthew and Luke. Let's just take a look at Matthew alone, chapters 1 and 2. Matthew was written about 10 years after Mark, or compiled, I think it's probably better to say, but compiled according to a plan. The author of Matthew had a purpose, and it's likely that it was written at Antioch, where there was considerable ferment about this: how do we unite the Jewish people who saw becoming faithful to Christ, becoming followers of Christ, becoming part of this new people of the covenant that Jesus Christ means, but they still wanted to hold on to their Judaism and their Jewishness. And they were struggling because some of these upstarts, including Paul and to a very great extent Peter, and most of the others who were the apostles, were basically saying, Jesus is for all. And everything that you mean by being Jewish, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, are included in that. And they too are people of the covenant just like you are. And so the purpose then of Matthew's gospel is to establish the authenticity of Jesus as the Messiah. In other words, here's the credentials that Jesus has as Messiah, as the expected anointed one. But number two, hand in hand with that, he establishes the validity of including Gentiles into the Messianic community on an equal footing with Jews. Now, a couple of the basic problems behind that was facing the Jews was that they couldn't really trust these Gentile Christians when they would gather for a communal meal, gather to celebrate the Eucharist, because they might bring pork. And that would be a big no-no. And essentially, what Matthew is saying is, in Jesus, the law of the new covenant centers on Jesus, not on the law of Moses. He didn't really address whether they should continue to keep kosher or not. Most of them, I think, would assume that, yes, for the Jews at least, who followed Christ, they should observe kosher laws and the traditions of the circumcision. The other, of course, was that did Gentiles have to be circumcised? And that basically, addresses that. No, that is secondary, that is incidental. What is essential is acceptance, faith in Jesus Christ. So here, Matthew is writing from a Jewish point of view, addressing a mixed community, but addressing largely the Jews within that mixed community, saying, this is what it means to be one in Jesus Christ. Now, so what he's going to do in his gospel is try to establish, especially the beginning, the Christmas story, he is writing it from a Jewish perspective to authenticate Jesus as the Messiah. Naturally, he's going to begin with this genealogy. And then Joseph's dilemma that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and the annunciation to Joseph in a dream. And in doing this, he is reflecting on, well, there was a previous Joseph who was a dreamer, and God spoke to him and actually ended up saving his people from famine because of the dream that the previous Joseph had. And so then there's also the parallels with the other dreams and the other angelic annunciations in the Old Testament, one of which we heard this morning, the announcement to mother of Samson. So he took his wife into his home as commanded, had no relations with her until she bore a son and named him Jesus. That, of course, does not necessarily imply that he had relations with her afterwards. That seems to be a stumbling block for many Protestants, for many Christians, especially, trying to deal with the brothers and sisters of Jesus. But there's alternative explanations, as we mentioned, to that to this and to the brothers and sisters of Jesus that do uphold the faith which is from the very earliest days of Mary's perpetual virginity. So in chapter 2 of Matthew, we have the visit of the Magi and the rejection of Jesus by Herod. And this visit of the Magi, what Matthew is attempting to do is to establish Jesus' authenticity from the perspective of the foreigners. That Jews need to get used to what has been a message of many of the prophets, especially Isaiah, that they have a mission to everybody, not just to be God's people, but to be God's people for the world. And so the Magi, who were Persian, Zoroastrian priests, they would represent the religiousness of the Gentiles coming to pay homage to Jesus. At the same time, Herod is representing his own who reject him. And then the flight into Egypt echoes the captivity and liberation of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Basically, Matthew is saying, look, Jesus repeats what was done in the past as a sign of bringing it all to fulfillment. The massacre of the infants alludes to the destructive power of rejecting God's saving action, and the return to Nazareth. Notice in Matthew's Gospel, they don't return to Bethlehem, which is portrayed as their hometown, but they return to Nazareth. The reason being with the death of Herod the Great, his rule split, and his son Archelaus, who was reputed to be just as bad as Herod, took over Judea, where Bethlehem was, and his son Antipas ruled Galilee in the north, and he was regarded as being not as dangerous, not as severe as Archelaus. So for safety's sake, they returned to Nazareth. Matthew, of course, sees that as also fulfilling a prophecy that he shall be a Nazarene. But that also has a somewhat ambiguous meaning because it comes from the Hebrew word meaning a shoot. And so that also was used by the Nazarites and other pious groups as, depicting their identity over and above the trunk, which was often cut off. So Nazarene, like I say, has several meanings. Now, in Luke, notice in Matthew too, there is no census journey. They don't begin, Matthew does not begin in Nazareth. There's no indication that they were ever in Nazareth in Matthew's gospel. It begins really assuming that they have a home in Bethlehem. Now, Luke tells it very differently. Is he just including details that are real that Matthew omitted, or is he kind of just telling the story from a different perspective and having the home in Nazareth and having to then have this census so that accounts for Jesus actually being born in Jerusalem. So anyway, the Gospel of Luke, written about the same time as Matthew. So they're within a few years of each other, probably, for a largely Gentile audience, not Jewish, but Gentile, regarding the same thing that Matthew is dealing with, and that is how to be an inclusive community. Gentiles were struggling because they often were being rejected by even the Jewish Christians for the reasons I talked about earlier. And yet they need to be affirmed in their dignity that even if they don't have a Jewish heritage, they are receiving everything that the Jewish Christians have in Christ. There is no difference. They are on an equal footing in the community with the Jewish Christians. They were not second-class citizens as often they seem to be. Now, Luke was a well-educated elite, probably raised as a pagan, became familiar with the Jewish way of life and became familiar with Jesus and became one of his followers. He shows that he had a good pagan education in rhetoric and the style of writing and so on, as well as he shows a very deep familiarity with Judaism. So he was a good bridge person there. And very possibly he was one of those who were the Gentiles who were not able to become Jewish because they didn't want to accept everything, the practice of circumcision and the kosher food, or he may well have actually become a Jewish convert, Jewish proselyte. Now, how to overcome this is what he tried to address, how to overcome the religious cultural barriers, emphasizing Jesus turning the established order upside down. Special concern for the poor, the outcast, and the marginalized. So what we're going to see in Luke's gospel is this concern for the marginalized and God doing the impossible. There are two announcements in the first chapter of Luke. One is to Zechariah, that instance in the temple, conception and birth of John, which we heard in the gospel today, and then the conception and birth of Jesus. There is the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth after this annunciation, and both are pregnant, both are carrying John and Jesus. And then the Canticle of Mary, which is based on the Canticle of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and the birth and circumcision and naming of John. So in other words, it goes from the announcements, the visitation is kind of a transition point, and then goes to the birth first of John, and then in the second chapter, the birth of Jesus. And we have then the census journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, the announcement to shepherds by the angels. Shepherds take the place of the Magi. And Matthew concentrates on the Magi, the foreigners being integrated. Luke concentrates on the poor, the revelation not to the halls of power, but the revelation to the shepherds who are keeping watch in their sheep at night. And they visit the child in the manger. They told of the angel's message, and Mary pondered. And then we go to the circumcision and naming of Jesus after 8 days. After 40 days, the presentation in the temple. So alluding to also Jesus, yes, having a Jewish identity, and yet the circumstances around his Jewish identity are broadening him from the standard of the Jews. Simeon was a prophet, Anna was a widow, and they were hangers-on kind of around the temple. They were not the official people. Jesus returned to Nazareth, and it's interesting, Luke says twice that Jesus grew in wisdom, age, and God's favor. Once when they return to Nazareth, and he is growing up, growing in wisdom, age, and God's favor. And then after his bar mitzvah in Jerusalem, remains in the temple, found, returns to Jerusalem, and that section concludes with, again, the same statement, Jesus grew in wisdom, age, and grace. So there's no Magi in Luke, there's no Herod, there's no flight into Egypt, there's no holy innocents. How we combine the two could be a little bit arbitrary, but we do, and that constitutes our Christmas story. John, however, has something different in mind. John concentrates on the eternal beginnings. He's not terribly interested in retelling the events of Jesus' birth, but rather, where did this Jesus come from anyway, and who was he? Well, he was God's Word. And he concentrates first on not the identity of the Son of God, or God the Son, but God the Word of God, with God, was God, all created through him, alluding to Genesis. God speaks the creative word. God says, let there be light, and there was light, and so on. He's saying that's Jesus. And so that Jesus is this Word made flesh, made his dwelling among us, and we saw his glory. The rest of John is just unfolding that. What did it mean for the Word to become flesh? What did it mean that he made his dwelling among us? What did it mean that we saw his glory? How do we witness it? Now, other elements of the Christmas story come from some of the apocryphal Gospels. The apocryphal Gospels were written a little later, perhaps in the 2nd century, some in the beginning of the 2nd century, others in the end of the 2nd century, the 200s, or rather the 100s, I should say, some going into the 200s, the 3rd century. They wanted to fill in with traditions, with stories and whatnot, what you didn't find in the canonical Gospels, the recognized Gospels. I always liken them to, they were the National Enquirer of the day. Well, things that are omitted in the Gospels, well, now let me tell you what really happened. And so the infancy Gospel of James, for example, goes deeply into the story of Mary's parents. That's where we get Mary's parents being Joachim and Anna from here. They're not in the Gospel, but from here. And a unique conception story, which I will not get into, but it's kind of quite interesting. And that Mary in her childhood was raised, dedicated to the Lord, raised in the temple. That being raised in the temple meant she was being raised by elderly priests. And that becomes kind of interesting too. Story of Joseph's selection as Mary's husband, how that took place. And the story of the midwife, and this is interesting, story of the midwife in the process of helping Mary give birth, discovering Mary's physical virginity, that the physical signs of virginity were still there. How do we know that? Well, because this National Enquirer story talks of how that was discovered by the midwife. I won't go into other details. Stories of Jesus' childhood also are in some of these infancy Gospels, like he made clay birds and then they flew away. Or one very interesting one says that Joseph was a carpenter, but he wasn't a very good carpenter, and Jesus had to help him out when he cut the board wrong and it was too short, and well, Jesus says, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll take care of it," and lengthens the board. That sort of thing came from these Gospels. That really takes care of what I was aiming for today. The next Banquet of the Word is going to be on Tuesday, January 9th, and there we'll cover ordinary time. Also, about several years back, I think it was in 2012, I gave a 3-part program at Good Shepherd on the infancy narratives, the infancy of Christ in the Bible. And that is available online. When I put this up on the YouTube, I'm going to give a link to my website, which is thomaswelbers.net, where you can acquire that if you want to see all 3 hours or 4 hours of it. You can look that up. So that having been said, thank you very much, and God bless you all. Now, if there are